A pivot table, if you've never made one before, basically summarizes the data in the Power Pivot data model, or any data model. In Excel, what you can do, if I just dive back to Excel, is you can go to Insert and Pivot Table. And so what I might do is, first of all, insert a new sheet. So I'll just click this little button at the bottom here. Click in the cell A1 and then go Insert Pivot Table. Now here, I want to cancel that, hit the drop down. Instead of just clicking the button, actually base the pivot table on your data model. So insert a pivot table from the data model. Click OK to position the pivot table in A1. So we'll just go OK there. And then this is what they call a field list on the right hand side. In fact, you'll see up here is something called Pivot Table Analyze. And if I turn off the field list, it disappears. And if I turn it on, it reappears. Now, also, if you click away from this pivot table here, it disappears and Pivot Table Analyze has disappeared. But if you click back on the Pivot Table report, your field list comes back and Pivot Table Analyze and Design come back. Now, when it comes to this field list, you can change the layout. At the moment, the sections are 1, 2, 3, 4 at the bottom here. But this little cog or gear stick, if you click this, you can change the sections. Let me move this over a little bit to some of these other options. So for example, in the notes, I'm recommending that maybe we change it to fields and sections side by side. And that allows you to actually see more in your fields list than if you were using this option here. You've only got a limited amount of space. So I'm going to change it to this layout, though there's a number of layouts you can choose. And I'll just move this back. Okay, so what we've got here is the sections here, and we've got our measures. You can see the measures here. I can actually stretch this as well. These are my key customer measures, nothing. My key order measures, there they are there that we created. My key product measures and my key supply measures that we created in the last video. Now the whole idea is I want to be able to also look at the tables. So these are tables, my data source, and this here is a connection to the product costs. So this we didn't actually load into this Excel file. So that's a data source query, whereas these are tables. Okay. So the thing I'd like to do now is actually expand the products table. And I want to drag product name, this field here, into the rows bucket. So we call these sections or buckets. And now I'm going to actually collapse products so I can see more what's going on here. And now I want to hit the chevron and open up the categories table. And I want to drag the category name into the rows as well, underneath product name or above product name. I'm going to go for above product name. Now I'll collapse the categories, and I now want to grab some of my key product measures. So in my key product measures, I had, for example, confection in stock, and I want to drag confection in stock into the values bucket or section. But I also, and notice the pivot table that's starting to develop over here in columns A and B. I also want to add another key product measure, and that's the average confection price. And I'm going to put that underneath confection in stock in the values bucket. So what we have here is we have a row, which is confections, the category name. Then we have the product names that belong to confections, and we have how many confections are currently in stock and what the average price is. So let's name this new sheet that we inserted, called, for me, sheet 1. I'm just going to double click its name, and I'm just going to call it confection summary. So it's a summary of our confection situation. And I'm also going to save the file, Control S, just so I don't lose anything. But I'd like to create now another pivot table. So I'm going to insert a new sheet just by hitting that button there. I'm going to go to Insert, hit the Pivot Table drop down, and say I want to create a pivot table from my data model. And OK. I'm going to open up categories and add the category name to my rows and collapse it. I'm going to open up suppliers and add the company name to my rows and collapse it. So here I can see my category and the companies that supply products that fall within that category. Now I'm also going to add one of my key product measures, and that is the number of products. And I want to add that to my values bucket. And I'll collapse that. And so what I'm saying is the number of products that are in stock by category and by product name. Now, what I might like to do is I might like to collapse these various categories. And I can do that by hitting this minus in front of beverages and the minus in front of condiments, but I certainly don't want to have to go down and hit the minus in front of every option. So what I'm going to do is hit this button here, which is a red minus on the Pivot Table Analyze tab, and it's called Collapse Field. It may, if your window's bigger, actually show like that, but mine isn't, so it shows like that. So I'm going to collapse this field, which means it collapses down all the category names and tells me the number in each number of products in each category. So you can see how this measure is, even though it's a measure that's aggregate, it's been influenced by what our rows is. It's only counting the number of products by category name. I now want to name this sheet, so I'm just going to double click its current name, and I want to call it products by category. And we've made 2 pivot tables. If I want to turn around and expand, I simply click on one of these category names and I hit the green plus or expand field, and it expands all the fields as opposed to the red minus, which collapses all the fields. And you've got to be sitting on one of the categories to collapse the categories, and sitting on one of the categories to expand the categories. So why or what is the difference between a standard Excel pivot table and a data model pivot table? Well, a standard pivot table, and this is covered in detail in our Excel Level 3A course, but a standard pivot table is based on one flat table. It doesn't deal with big data, and it just has standard calculations, and you really have to format each value in terms of currency and so on, and you can't reuse a formula. So it's just a simple pivot table that's based on a simple data set. That's when you use a standard pivot table. But if you have multiple tables and you have big data, then you want to use a pivot table based on a data model. You can also use DAX calculations, and you can create them once and you can reuse them many times, which we're going to look at. And you can create pivot tables for complex projects with big data. So basically, if I have more than one table and I have a lot of data, like over 50,000 rows, and I want to use DAX formulas because then I don't have to keep recreating the formulas. And of course, the number formatting is associated with the DAX formula, and I can use the formula over and over again. Then I create a data model pivot table instead of standard pivot table.